The rain had already started by the time I pulled off Route 9. I wasn't even supposed to be on that road. I'd taken the long way home from my sister Darlene's place because I didn't feel like getting on the highway. Too many trucks on Friday nights. And at 63, my nerves aren't what they used to be. So I was doing 35 on that old county road, windshield wipers going, thinking about nothing in particular, when my headlights caught something on the shoulder. I almost didn't stop. I want to be honest about that. For just a second I told myself it was a bag of trash, a deer, something that wasn't my business. But then I saw a hand. I pulled over so fast I went halfway into the mud. She was curled up against the guardrail like she'd been put there. Young, maybe late 20s, hair soaked through, one arm tucked under her. I called her name, then realized I didn't know her name. I said, "Honey, can you hear me?" And she made a sound that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Not a word, just something small and broken. I got down on my knees in the wet gravel. I took her face in my hands, and that's when I saw who it was. It was Stephanie, my son's wife. I need to back up, because you need to understand what kind of woman I was before that night. I wasn't soft. I wasn't the kind of mother-in-law who bakes pie and stays quiet. My name is June. I spent 31 years as a school principal in Macon County, North Carolina. Small district, tight budget, big problems. I raised my son Mitchell alone after his father left when Mitchell was 4. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and I made sure he knew what it meant to do right by people. Mitchell was 31 when he married Stephanie. I liked her from the moment I met her. She was quiet, yes, almost too quiet around my son's family, but there was something steady in her eyes. She'd grown up in Asheville, studied nursing, worked at the county hospital. She brought Mitchell a kind of peace I'd never been able to give him myself, and I was grateful for that. Her mother Deb was another matter. Deb Parrish had what I can only describe as a talent for making every room feel smaller. She showed up to the wedding 40 minutes late and spent the reception telling people the venue wasn't what she'd pictured. She called Stephanie by her childhood nickname, Stevie, in a way that wasn't warm. It was a leash. Every time Deb said Stevie, it meant, remember who you belong to. I noticed, but Mitchell was happy and Stephanie was happy, and I told myself it wasn't my business. That was my first mistake. Stephanie and Mitchell had been married about 2 years when she got pregnant the first time. They called me on a Sunday morning, both of them on speaker, Mitchell laughing, Stephanie's voice bright in a way I hadn't heard in a while. I drove up to Asheville that weekend with a pot of my mother's vegetable soup and a stuffed rabbit I'd saved since Mitchell was born. She lost the baby at 11 weeks. I won't go into the details of that loss because they're not mine to share. What I will tell you is what I saw when I got to their apartment after it happened. Deb was already there. She was sitting at their kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and when I walked in she looked at me like I was interrupting something. Like grief was a private club and I wasn't a member. She said, "Well, these things happen for a reason." I set my casserole dish on the counter, and I smiled, because that's what I do when I'm furious. I said, "They certainly do, Deb." And I went and found Stephanie in the bedroom, and I sat with her for 4 hours without saying much of anything. Over the next several months, I watched Deb circle her daughter like a hawk. Any time Stephanie made a decision, paint color for the nursery, they were already planning again, a new shift schedule at the hospital, whether to visit Mitchell's side of the family for Thanksgiving. Deb had an opinion, and not just an opinion. She had a way of making Stephanie feel foolish for thinking differently. Mitchell told me I was reading too much into it. "That's just how she is, Mum," he said. "Stephanie doesn't mind." But I watched Stephanie around her mother, the way she got smaller, the way she stopped finishing her own sentences. I minded. The second pregnancy was different from the start. Stephanie was more cautious, less willing to celebrate too early. She told me in person, just the two of us, at a diner in town. She held her coffee cup with both hands and said, "June, I need this one to work out." I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine and said, "Then let's make sure it does." For a while, things were good. The pregnancy was progressing. Stephanie looked tired but well. Mitchell had gotten a promotion at his firm. He did commercial real estate, handled accounts across 3 counties, and they were talking about buying a house. Then Deb moved to Asheville. She said it was to be closer to Stephanie during the pregnancy. She rented a place 12 minutes from their apartment. She started dropping by without calling. She started going to some of Stephanie's appointments, not all, just enough. Stephanie mentioned once, casually, that her mother had been making her herbal teas for the nausea. She mentioned it the way you mention the weather. I asked what kind. She said she didn't know. Something Deb ordered online, something her own mother used to make. I didn't say anything, but I thought about it later. I thought about it a lot. In October, about 6 months into the pregnancy, Stephanie called me at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. She sounded far away, like she was talking through water. She said she wasn't feeling well. She said Mitchell was at a conference in Charlotte and she didn't want to bother him. And she didn't want to call her mother because her mother would panic and she didn't know who else to call. I was in my car in 4 minutes. When I got to her apartment, she was on the bathroom floor. She'd been sick, she said, more than once. Her hands were shaking and her lips looked dry. I helped her to the couch and got her water, and I took one look at her and I said, "We're going to the emergency room." She said she didn't want to make a fuss. I said, "Stephanie, you're 26 weeks pregnant and you're shaking. Get your coat." They admitted her. The ER doctor ordered fluids and monitoring and asked her a lot of questions. At some point, a nurse pulled me into the hallway and asked if I knew what Stephanie had eaten or taken that day. I said I didn't. The nurse's face was careful, professional, but something in her tone made the back of my neck go cold. I went back into Stephanie's room and I sat next to her bed, and I held her hand and she looked at me and said, very quietly, I didn't eat anything strange. I just had the tea. I asked her which tea. She said, "The one my mother brought over this afternoon." Mitchell came back from Charlotte the next morning. He walked into that hospital room, and the first thing he did was hug his wife, and I could see the relief on his face. The second thing he did was call Deb to let her know Stephanie was all right. I watched him make that call. I watched him explain what had happened. Heard him say Stephanie had gotten sick. Heard him say the doctors thought it was probably something she ate. Heard him. And this is the part I need you to understand. Heard him say, "No, don't worry, she's fine," in the exact tone you use when you're protecting someone, not protecting Stephanie, protecting Deb. I didn't say anything in that room, but I followed him into the hallway and I said, "Mitchell, how long have you known about those teas?" He looked at the floor. He said, "Mom, it's not." I said, "How long?" He said, "She means well." He said it like that, "She means well." Not, "She didn't do anything wrong." Not, "I looked into it and it's fine." She means well, like a man who knows something he's chosen not to look at directly. I went back into that room. I sat back down next to Stephanie. I picked up her hand again, and I made myself a promise. I am not a reckless woman. I'm not dramatic. I don't move fast when I'm angry because I've learned that moving fast when you're angry is how you make mistakes. So I did what I always did when I ran into something I didn't understand. I researched. I called a friend of mine from back in my school days. A woman named Harriet who had spent 20 years as a labor and delivery nurse. I described what Stephanie had experienced that night, the shaking, the nausea, the timeline. I mentioned the herbal teas, said they were something a family member had brought over, said they were ordered online. Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me 2 questions. She asked whether Stephanie had any history of adverse reactions, and she asked whether the episodes had happened more than once. I thought about the first pregnancy. I thought about the things no one had ever quite explained. I said, yes, more than once. She said, June, I'm going to send you some information, and you're going to want to talk to someone at the hospital. Not Stephanie's OB, someone else. I'm not going to go into everything that came after that conversation, because some of it is still painful, and some of it is not fully mine to tell. What I'll say is this. Harriet connected me with a woman at the hospital, a social worker named Faye, and Faye connected me with a doctor who specialized in high-risk pregnancies. And over the course of about 3 weeks, quietly, without anyone knowing, I started putting pieces together. The teas Deb had been giving Stephanie contained blue cohosh. If you don't know what that is, I'll tell you. It's an herb that has been used for centuries to induce labor. In the wrong doses during pregnancy, it can cause contractions. It can cause far worse. It is not something you order for nausea. It is not something any responsible person gives to a pregnant woman without her knowledge. I sat with that information for 4 days before I did anything. 4 days of cooking dinner, answering emails, sleeping badly, waking up at 3 in the morning with my hands curled into fists. I thought about what Deb was. I don't think she was a monster in the way we picture monsters. I think she was a woman who would never let her daughter belong to herself, and when Stephanie built a life that pulled her further away, a husband, a home, a child coming, something in Deb couldn't bear it. Maybe she told herself she was helping. Maybe she convinced herself so thoroughly that she believed it. People do that. They wrap their worst impulses in language that sounds like love. But I was not going to let her hurt that baby, and I was not going to let my son keep choosing his comfort over his wife's life. I called Darlene first. My sister is 70 years old, and she has outlived 2 husbands, raised 4 children, and once sat across from a county commissioner who tried to cut funding for her food bank and did not blink. When I explained what I had found, she was quiet for exactly 10 seconds. Then she said, "What do you need?" I said. "I need you to come up to Asheville next Saturday and have dinner with me, and I need you to trust me." She said, "Always have." The dinner was at Stephanie and Mitchell's house. I planned it. I invited both of them, and I invited Deb. Mitchell thought it was a nice gesture, his mother making an effort with his mother-in-law. I let him think that. I also, in the week leading up to it, did 3 things. First, I went to see Faye, the social worker, and I asked her what my options were. She laid them out for me plainly. She told me what could be reported, what could be documented, what would require Stephanie's participation and what wouldn't. She gave me names and numbers. She was kind and direct, and she didn't treat me like an old woman who didn't understand what she was getting into. Second, I called Mitchell, not to confront him, not yet. I called him and I said, "I need you to listen to me tonight, and I need you not to defend her before I finish." He was quiet. He said, "Okay." I told him what I had found. I told him about the blue cohosh. I told him what Harriet had told me, what the high-risk doctor had confirmed. I told him about the first pregnancy. I told him that his silence had not been kindness. It had been a choice, and that choice had consequences. He cried. I'm not going to pretend he didn't, because he did. And I'm also not going to tell you it fixed everything, because it didn't. But he said, and this is what mattered, what do you want me to do? Not what do you want me to say? What do you want me to say? What do you want me to do? That's my son in there, somewhere. I had to believe that. Third, I bought a small recorder, legal in North Carolina, and I put it in my coat pocket. The dinner started the way those things always do. Polite conversation, someone commenting on the food, Deb asking about the nursery progress in that way of hers that always sounds like she's evaluating rather than asking. Stephanie sat at the end of the table looking tired. She was 8 months along by then. She moved carefully, the way women do at the end. Darlene was magnificent. She has this ability, I've never been able to replicate it, to make people feel so comfortable that they stop performing. She asked Deb about her garden, about where she'd lived before Asheville, about her own mother, and Deb, who prided herself on being guarded, started to open up in that warm, familiar way that felt like relief. And then Darlene said very gently, "You know, I've always believed that when we love someone, sometimes we hold on a little too tight. Have you ever felt that way, Deb?" Deb laughed. She said, "Oh, Stephanie knows I worry." Darlene nodded. "What is it you worry about exactly?" And Deb, "I still don't fully understand how Darlene did this." Deb said, "I just want things to go right this time." Darlene said, "This time?" The table went quiet. Deb's eyes moved to me and then away. She said, "Well, with the first one, things didn't." And I said quietly, "What did you do, Deb?" She looked at me the way people look when they realize they've been in a room longer than they thought. I said, "I'm not asking to be cruel. I'm asking because I've spoken to doctors and I've spoken to a social worker and I know what was in those teas, and I need you to tell me in front of your daughter, in front of my son, what you did." What followed was not a confession in the dramatic sense. It was more like a collapse. Deb didn't yell or deny. She got very small very quickly. She started crying, and through the crying came fragments. She hadn't meant for it to go that far. She just didn't want Stephanie to be locked in. She thought if the first one didn't work out, and maybe they'd slow down. Maybe Stephanie would reconsider. Maybe Stephanie had gone completely still. I watched my son put his hand over his mouth. Darlene just sat there, steady, not touching her food, watching. When Deb stopped talking, Stephanie looked at her for a long time. And then she said, very calmly, "I want you to leave." Deb said, "Stevie." Stephanie said, "Don't." "My name is Stephanie. You leave tonight, and you do not come back until I ask you to, and I don't know when that will be." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weeks after that dinner were complicated in the way that real things are complicated. There were lawyers involved, briefly. There was a report filed. Deb entered a program, not because we forced her, but because I think some part of her understood what she had done and was ashamed enough to want to do something about it. Whether that's enough, whether shame ever is, I honestly don't know. Mitchell and Stephanie went to counseling. It was hard. I know it was hard because Stephanie told me so one afternoon at my kitchen table over bad coffee and good cornbread. She said, "I love him, June, but I need him to understand that loving me quietly while I was being hurt was still a choice." I told her that was exactly right. I also told her that I'd been afraid to speak up for 2 years, and that my fear had been its own kind of silence, and that I was sorry for it. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "You showed up. That night on the road. You showed up when it mattered." I didn't cry. I almost did. The baby came on a Wednesday morning in December during a sleet storm. I sat in the waiting room with Darlene for 6 hours. She did a crossword. I pretended to read a magazine. At 9:47 in the morning, Mitchell came through those double doors with the look on his face that I had waited 30 years to see. They named her Clara. She has Stephanie's eyes and Mitchell's ears, and absolutely no one's patience, which I suspect she gets from me. I hold her sometimes on Sunday afternoons while her parents get a few hours of quiet. She grabs my finger and looks up at me with that ancient, solemn focus that babies have, like they're trying to figure out exactly what kind of world they've landed in. I want to be honest with her when she's old enough. I want to tell her that this world will hand her people who love her badly, people who mean well and do harm anyway, people who confuse control with care. I want her to know the difference. I want her to know that love without honesty is just management, that real love makes room for the person to become who they're meant to be. I want her to know that women like her grandmother Darlene exist in this world, the kind who show up steady and don't flinch. I want her to know that she can be that woman too. And I want her to know that on a rainy Friday night on Route 9, her grandmother June pulled over. Because that's what you do when someone needs you. You pull over. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened in that story. Not just the events, the tea, the hospital, the dinner, but the mechanics of it, how it started, how it kept going, and why it finally stopped. The truth I keep coming back to is this: nothing that happened was sudden, not the harm and not the healing either. Deb didn't make one terrible decision. She made dozens of small ones over years, each one a little easier because the last one had gone unpunished. That's how people end up somewhere they never meant to go, not in one leap, but in small steps that each feel manageable at the time. And I have to include myself in that, because I saw things early. I saw the way Deb said her daughter's name like a correction. I saw Stephanie get smaller in certain rooms. I noticed the tease, and I didn't follow that noticing all the way to the end. I told myself it wasn't my business, and in that telling I made myself a bystander in something I could have interrupted sooner. That's the part that still sits with me. Not what Deb did, but what I almost let happen by staying quiet to keep the peace. We treat silence like it's neutral, like not speaking is the same as not choosing. It isn't. Silence is a choice, and it has consequences just like any other choice does. Mitchell taught me that in a painful way. He knew something was wrong. I believe that. I don't think he was a bad man. I think he was a man who had learned that keeping things smooth was the same as keeping things good. It isn't. Smooth and good are two completely different things. One is comfortable, the other takes work and sometimes costs you something. What I want anyone to take from what I've told you is not that Deb got what she deserved, though I believe in accountability. What I want you to take is something smaller and more useful. The intelligence to look clearly at what's in front of you, even when looking is uncomfortable. The courage to act on what you see, even when acting is inconvenient. And the steadiness to follow through, not in anger, not in panic, but in the quiet, determined way that Darlene sat at that dinner table and didn't flinch. Those three things, seeing clearly, acting honestly, and holding steady, are what I'd call a life well built. Not a perfect life, not an easy one, but one you can stand behind. Stephanie is doing well now, so is Clara. Mitchell is doing the work that needs doing. And me, I drive Route 9 sometimes still, on Friday evenings, taking the long way home. I don't look at that guardrail the same way anymore, but I don't look away from it either.